chronological age may not be the same thing as biological age. And of course, we've known that somebody can be 25 years biologically, and yet they're chronologically much older. Chronologically, they're 50 or 60, but they're physically fit and mentally fit, and you measure their biomarkers, their biological age is much younger. On the other hand, you can have somebody who's very young, who can be 25, and they're physically burnt out and emotionally burnt out, and you measure their biomarkers, they reflect the age of an old person. So human aging is fluid. It can even be reversed. And these possibilities are at the level not only of the physical body, or these interventions for reversal are not only at the level of the physical body, but also the emotional body, which we'll be talking about, and through spiritual experience. There are a number of studies that indicate that each of these interventions works independently, some at the level of the environment, some at the level of the body itself, some at the level of our psychology and emotions, and yet others through a spiritual experience. For example, a few years ago, scientists at Tufts University School of Medicine took some people, older people, some of these were between the ages of 60 and 72, but some were even older. They were over the age of 95. And they introduced them to a physical fitness program, including a gradually increasing weight training program. And after a while, when the biomarkers of aging were measured, and 10 biomarkers were measured, all of them had reversed. And some people who were actually between the ages of 60 and 72 were more physically fit, had more physical stamina and endurance, and could lift heavier weights than others that were 25 years of age. A remarkable finding, because it shows for the first time that we have to alter our whole expectation of what it means to age. An even more interesting study was done by a scientist, a psychologist at Harvard University by the name of Ellen Langer, who in the mid-80s advertised in a Boston newspaper that she wanted people over the age of 75 to participate in what can be called now in retrospect a time experiment. All these people were over the age of 75, and they were taken to a retreat a few miles outside of Boston, where an environment was created from the 50s, from 1959, as a matter of fact. And they watched movies of that era, like Anatomy of a Murder, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, A Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. They watched Fidel Castro and Khrushchev on television. They had Life magazines and other things from that, the Saturday Evening Post from that era, and all the sensory stimuli replicated the experience of the 50s. The underlying premise of this study is that sometimes a remembered experience can create the same flux of neurotransmitters and hormones as the real experience. An experience in imagination can create a flow of chemicals in your system that replicates the actual experience. For example, if you were to close your eyes right this moment and imagine that you were licking a lemon, you can try it right now if you want. Imagine that you're licking a lemon and you'll immediately see that there's the secretion of salivary enzymes. If you were to imagine that you were running after a train, it could speed up your heart rate. If you were to imagine that you were going to sleep, it would slow down your heart rate. If you were to imagine, as some yogis in ancient India and even today can do, that you have hot coals in your hand, that will increase the temperature of your hand. And if you simultaneously imagine that you have ice cubes in the other hand, it will decrease the temperature of your hand. If you imagine a stressful experience you've had only recently or even in the remote past, that will cause the release of adrenaline and cortisol in your system, might even generate some hydrochloric acid in your stomach and cause the experience of heartburn. So people have known for a long time that a remembered experience and a real experience can cause the same flux of neurotransmitters and the same flow or rush of chemicals in the system as the real experience. So Dr. Langer said to these people, be as you were in the 50s. And what happened? Within a week, several of the biomarkers that were studied had reversed quite dramatically, including things like flexibility of fingers, even the length of fingers, other biomarkers like hearing and vision had reversed. And this intervention did not include things like physical exercise, a change in diet, or meditation, or taking antioxidants, all of which we also know independently can have an effect on the biomarkers of aging. And the reason I mention studies like this is not because I think it's appropriate for us to immediately go to a retreat and imagine we're living in the 50s. The reason I mention studies like this is to really bring home one really important point. What is this thing that we call everyday reality? What is everyday reality? That's the point I want to bring forward just now. Perhaps what we call everyday reality is nothing other than a socially programmed hypnosis, an induced fiction in which we have collectively agreed to participate in. And once in a while, somebody breaks out of that hypnosis of social conditioning. It's an interesting and motley group of sages and psychotics and geniuses. Our whole experience of everyday reality comes about as a result of the interpretation of sensory experience. That's how we experience the world after all, through our senses, what we see and touch and taste and smell. And of course, we even have expressions like seeing is believing. If you can see something, if you can touch it, it has texture, it has color, then it's real, it's solid. And if you cannot experience it through your senses, then you say, well, it's not so real, it's just in my imagination. I hope to convince you, by the time we're finished tonight, that if you can see it and touch it, it's probably just an illusion, doesn't have intrinsic reality, and it's the child of something that you cannot experience through your senses, that you cannot possibly even imagine, that is non-conceptualizable, and yet more real than anything in your mind or anything that you can experience through your senses. Abstract, ineffable, mysterious, incomprehensible to a lot of people, but experiential. And we will get into what that is, because it may be our essential nature. The fact is that the world out there, even though it is enormous and huge and solid, does not have an existence independent of an observer. In other words, the physical world is literally a response of the observer. This here is the response of those who are observing this. It's a response of the observer because it is dependent on the instruments that you use to make the observation. The instruments that we use to make observations are essentially our receptors and our nervous system. And the way we use those instruments, and the way we've learned to use those instruments, gives us a certain picture of reality. And we think that the picture of reality is reality. But what I want to prove to you tonight is that there is a difference between reality and our perception of reality. A well-known experiment that is known to many scientists who study the field of cognition is one where scientists took some kittens and they brought them up in a room that had only horizontal stripes. These kittens were exposed to stimuli in the environment, visual stimuli, just horizontal stripes. Another group of kittens were brought up in a room that had vertical stripes. And when these kittens grew up to be wise old cats, then one group of cats could see only a horizontal world. The other group of cats could see only a vertical world. And it had nothing to do with the belief system of these cats. It seems they didn't have the interneuronal connections, which means the connections between neurons to either see a horizontal world or a vertical world. What happened? These kittens, being exposed only to horizontal stimuli, they made an interpretation. Their nervous system made an interpretation. Maybe not in English, maybe not with an Indian accent, but nevertheless, there was some process going on in the consciousness of these kittens. Everything looks horizontal, so everything must be horizontal. And then the nervous system, in fact, developed in such a way that it ended up reinforcing that interpretation. So ultimately what they saw was their interpretation. I can guarantee you that most of what we see out there is an interpretation, literally. I'm not speaking metaphorically. It's a function of our receptors and how we've learned to use those receptors. And this is true of all living species, not just us as human beings. A honeybee, when it looks at a flower, because it cannot sense the usual wavelengths of light that you and I respond to, but is aware of ultraviolet radiation, can sense ultraviolet radiation. A honeybee, when it looks at a flower, it doesn't see the flower you and I see, even though it can sense honey from a distance. A snake senses its environment through infrared sensors. A bat knows it as the echo of ultrasound. Whales and dolphins navigate through echolocation and by sensing the magnetic fields of the earth, as do homing pigeons and other species of birds. A chameleon's eyeballs swivel on two different axes. You can't even remotely imagine what this room would look like to a chameleon. So what's the real picture of the world? What's the real texture of the world? What's it really like? And the answer is, it depends on who's looking, what kind of instruments they're using. This is a set of instruments, and when they make that observation, and what kind of questions they're asking themselves when they make that observation. It is literally a response of the observer. The picture of the world is not the look of it, it's our way of looking at it. And we have learned how to look at it in a certain way. We have looked at it until now through what I can only call the superstition of materialism. The superstition of materialism, which holds that this is a physical world and that we are physical entities in a physical world. This is the superstition of materialism. It says, trust your senses, when even common sense informs us that, if anything, our senses are the least reliable test of reality. After all, our senses tell us that the earth is flat. Nobody believes that anymore. Our senses tell us that this ground we're standing on is stationary, and we know it's spinning at dizzying speeds and moving through outer space at thousands of miles an hour. The senses tell us that things have a texture, a color, a form, an appearance, a color, a taste, a smell, and we tend to think this is the intrinsic nature of our objects. It's not. It's the intrinsic nature of the observer that is making the observation. So I think if we want to get to a new understanding of the human body-mind and of human potential, we have to discard our old notions about reality, which are based on the superstition of materialism. We have to forget thinking of the human body as a frozen anatomical structure. When I went to medical school, at least when I went to medical school, I wanted to know the meaning of life. That was my motivation for going to medical school. And the first thing I was introduced to was a corpse. I was supposed to understand the meaning of life by examining a dead body. And that model stays with us. We look at the human body as a frozen anatomical structure. And we look at consciousness as the epiphenomenon of this material body. That if you have thoughts and feelings and emotions and desires and instincts and drives, if you fall in love, if you believe in God or heaven or hell or salvation or damnation, all this is just the dance of molecules. Biochemistry produces this thing that we call thought. And if we just understand how these molecules behave, then we'll be able to solve our problems. Science based on the materialistic model, has attempted to understand the mechanisms of disease, in the hope that if you could understand the mechanisms of disease and interfere with those mechanisms of disease, you should be able to get rid of disease. Unfortunately, that hasn't worked because mechanisms of disease are not the origins of disease. Moreover, origins of disease are not the origins of health. Health, which is not the mere absence of disease, but in fact a state of vitality, of energy, of creativity, ultimately a higher state of consciousness. So let us look at a model that is beyond the materialistic model. So let us try and look at the human body, which is a little beyond this materialistic model. Focusing on mechanisms of disease and interfering with mechanisms of disease can in fact influence the outcome of disease. There's no question about this. All of medicine, modern medicine, is based on this very successful model also. It is based on the idea that if you know how bacteria multiply and you can interfere with that with the appropriate antibiotic, then you shouldn't have infections anymore. Or if you understand how cancer cells replicate at the level of the DNA and you can interfere with that with the appropriate chemotherapy, then that should get rid of cancer. Or if you understand how hydrochloric acid binds to its receptor sites and stomach walls and you can interfere with that, you shouldn't have ulcers. And this works sometimes. It works sometimes, and the materialistic model is extremely effective in the treatment of acute illness. But when we look at the overall spectrum of disease in society, we find that the materialistic model does not really significantly alter the overall incidence of disease in society, the incidence, the morbidity, the mortality. And in fact, even as we treat illness, sometimes we inadvertently sow the seeds of illness for the future. It has been estimated that about 1.5 million people in the United States suffer annually from antibiotic-resistant infections that are acquired only in hospitals. That in fact, several thousand die from these infections. Studies have revealed that we spend over $3 billion a year on treating iatrogenic infections, infections acquired in hospitals. That the #1 cause of drug addiction in the world is not street drugs, but medical prescriptions that are legally prescribed by physicians. That despite the fact that more people are doing research on cancer than have cancer, the incidence of cancer has actually increased in the last 3 decades. A physician friend of mine remarked a few years ago that more people live off cancer than die from it. A study that was published several years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine revealed that in a university hospital, 36% of patients were suffering from iatrogenic disease, which means disease as a direct result of medical intervention, disease a person happened to have because they happened to be in the hospital or saw a physician. It has also been estimated that between 30 to 50, and in some studies, as many as 80% of the population in the United States, in Great Britain and Canada, swallows a medically prescribed chemical every 24 hours. So I think something is wrong with this materialistic model, which is very successful in acute illness, but it also gives us the idea that the solution to our life's problems is a magic bullet, an instantaneous solution, a magical solution that happens in the moment because you know the mechanisms of disease. As I said earlier, mechanisms of disease are not origins of disease, and origins of disease are not origins of health. If you want to understand the origins of health, we have to ask a deeper question, and that is, what is life? Life, not merely in its expressions in the human body-mind, but life in its essence, as it expresses itself in all living forms. What is life? Science seeks to define life in its expressions, in its mechanisms. In fact, recently I asked a scientific friend of mine, a physician, I said, do you have a good definition for life? And he said, yes, of course, it's a sexually transmitted, incurable disease. If we want to know the meaning of life, I think we have to go a little bit beyond that. The human body is actually a river of intelligence, of energy, of information. And it's constantly renewing itself in every moment of your existence. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, you cannot step into the same river twice because new water is always flowing in. And just like that, you, the real you, in a moment we'll try and figure out who that real you is, the real you cannot step into the same flesh and bones twice. Because in every moment of your existence, you're renewing your body more easily and more effortlessly and more spontaneously than you can even change your clothes. One can look at a number of physiological processes to see how literally true this is. It has been estimated that even with one breath that you breathe in, you take in 10 to the power of 22 atoms from the universe. It's a huge amount of raw material that comes from everywhere in existence and ends up as your heart cells, your brain cells, your kidney cells, and so on. With each breath that you breathe out 10 to the power of 22 atoms, and these have their origin in every cell of your body. So you're literally breathing out bits and pieces of your heart and kidney and brain tissue, and technically speaking, we're all intimately sharing our organs with each other all the time. A great American poet by the name of Walt Whitman once said, every atom belonging to you as well belongs to me. Every atom belonging to you as well belongs to me. And this is not a metaphor of poetry, it's a fact of physiology. Scientists have speculated, based on mathematical calculations as a result of radioactive isotope studies, that right this moment, you may have in your physical body at least 1 million atoms that were once in the body of Christ, or Buddha, or Mahatma Gandhi, or Genghis Khan, or Mr. Saddam Hussein, or anyone else that you care to think about. In just the last 3 weeks, a quadrillion atoms, which is 10 followed by 15 zeros, a quadrillion atoms have circulated through your body that have circulated through the body of every other living species on our planet. Think of a tree in Africa, a squirrel in Siberia, a peasant in China, and you have in your physical body raw material that was floating there 3 weeks ago. In less than 1 year, it is estimated that you replace 98% of all the atoms in your body. So on the atomic level, you make a new liver every 6 weeks, a new skin once a month, a new stomach lining every 5 days, a new skeleton, which is so hard and solid, it seems permanent, but the skeleton is a dynamic organ that replaces itself every 3 months. And the DNA, the genetic raw material of your body, which holds the memories of millions of years of evolutionary time, the actual raw material, which means the carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen, the nitrogen, it comes and goes every 6 weeks, almost like migratory birds. So if you think you are your physical body, then you certainly have a bit of a dilemma. Which one are you talking about? I'm giving you this lecture using my 1995 model, I believe. And the last time I came to Los Angeles to give this lecture, I brought with me the same suitcase, but not the same physical body. Because the physical body is recycled earth, water, and air. It's recycled carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen and a few other elements from the periodic table. Go to a hardware store and you can buy the raw material for about $7. The physical body is recycled earth, water, air, recycled elements. It comes and goes in the twinkling of an eye. And the expression that everyone's familiar with, that you are dust, you come from the dust, and you circulate for a little while, and disappear back into the dust is actually a literal expression. This is dust. It's made out of dust. I would like to suggest to you then a possible alternative to viewing ourselves. And that possible alternative is that we may not be our physical bodies. That which we call the physical body is perhaps just the place that our memories and our dreams call home for the time being. That we are confusing the horse with the rider. That the real me is not these molecules on which I ride. William Shakespeare, in one of his plays, uses the expression, we are such stuff that dreams are made on. Perhaps that's not a metaphor of poetry, perhaps a fact of physiology. In fact, as I look at this whole body of literature that is now investigating the field of body, mind, soul, and spirit, I find some very fascinating studies and case studies and observations emerging in this field. A cardiologist friend of mine called Dr. Bruno Cortes from the city of Chicago recently reported a case, a young woman in her 30s who had just had a heart transplant, a cardiac transplant. And shortly after surgery, when she recovered from general anesthesia, she noticed that she was having intense cravings for chicken nuggets and beer. And at the same time, she was having dreams. And in the dreams, she was seeing a certain person. And this person was conversing to her, saying, my name is Timmy so-and-so, I love you, you have my heart. After she was discharged from the hospital, she went to her library, looked at the obituary columns, found Timmy, young man, 19 years of age, had recently come out of one of these fast food chains when he'd had a lot of beer and chicken nuggets, was riding a motorcycle, had a fatal crash, and inside her body, she had his heart. He happened to be the donor of the heart. And since then, Dr. Cortes and other cardiologists are now looking at cellular memory in transplant patients. When I first heard this story, I said to my friends, if I'd heard it the first time 10 years ago, I'd probably give the cardiologist and the patient 100 milligrams of Thorazine and call the psychiatrist. But we are living in a very interesting age. We cannot afford to do that anymore. In our age, today in 1995, we are in the midst of what can only be called the climactic overthrow of the superstition of materialism. In fact, all our technology is built on this overthrow of the superstition of materialism. Today, if you can use a fax machine or listen to a program on the radio or watch something on television, all these technologies today are based on a very basic premise that scientists have. And that basic premise is that the essential nature of the material world is that it's not material. That the essential stuff of the universe is non-stuff. These technologies would not have been possible if scientists hadn't pierced the mask of matter. These technologies would not have been possible if scientists hadn't pierced the mask of matter to enter the world of energy and information. The essential stuff of the universe is non-stuff. What is interesting is that this is not ordinary non-stuff. It may be thinking non-stuff. If today you go to a really good physicist, a quantum field physicist, you ask her, what's the true nature of anything physical? She will tell you, it's not physical. The physicist will tell you that the human body is made up of atoms. The atoms in turn are subatomic particles that are moving at lightning speeds around huge empty spaces. And these subatomic particles, even though we call them particles, they're not actual things. They are fluctuations of energy and information in a huge void. Seen through the eyes of a physicist, the human body is proportionately as void as intergalactic space. If you could see it as it really is, you'd see a huge empty void with a few scattered dots and spots and some random electrical discharges. Because the fact is that 99.99% of the human body is mostly empty space. And the 0.001% that you experience as material is actually also empty space. In other words, this whole thing is made out of nothing. Go beyond the facade of molecules, and you enter a subatomic cloud. Go beyond the cloud, you end up with a handful of nothing. And then the question is, what is this nothingness from where we come? What is this nothingness from where we all come? A great Sufi poet by the name of Rumi lived in Lebanon in the Middle East 1,000 years ago. He said, we come spinning out of nothingness, scattering stars like dust. He said, look at these worlds spinning out of nothingness. This is within your power. He said, out beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. What is this nothingness? Is it just a void, or could it be the womb of creation? Is it possible, just vaguely possible, that nature goes to exactly the same place to create a galaxy of stars or a cluster of nebulas or a rainforest or a human body as it goes to create a thought? Have you ever wondered what a thought is? Have you ever wondered where it comes from? What is a thought? I would like to suggest to you that a thought is a quantum event. For those of you who are not familiar with this terminology of physics, a quantum is defined by a physicist as the smallest indivisible unit in which waves of information and energy are either emitted or absorbed. So a quantum of light, for example, is known as a photon. A quantum of electricity is known as an electron. A quantum of gravity is a so-called graviton, the basic subatomic particle in the universe that glues the universe together. But these are just labels, labels for defining units of energy and information. A thought is fleeting, it's unpredictable, it's invisible. So is a quantum. Fleeting, unpredictable, invisible. A thought is also a unit of information and energy. Every thought that you have is a unit of information and energy. If you have the thought, wiggle my toes, then that has two components. Energy, otherwise your toes wouldn't wiggle, and information, that's a precise set of instructions, which is very different from blinking the eyes. Quantum events create the manifest universe out there. But quantum events create the manifest body in here as well. Thoughts, being quantum events, transform themselves into space-time events that we call matter. And this is not just an idle, philosophical, Eastern speculation. This has its basis in science. It has been known now for almost 15, 20 years that there are biochemical substrates to the thinking process, that emotions and feelings and desires and instincts and drives and memories, they transform themselves into biochemical events. These biochemical messengers from inner space, when they were first identified, they were called neuropeptides because they were found in the brain, and they're proteins. And this is how brain cells communicate with each other, through the language of neuropeptides. It was subsequently found, however, that there were receptors to these neuropeptides, not only in brain cells, but in all the cells of the body. So when scientists started looking at immune cells, cells that protect you from cancer and infection and degenerative disorders, and even the ravages of time, scientists found that these little immune cells had little receptor sites for the same neuropeptides that are produced in the brain as a result of thought and feeling and emotion. In other words, your immune cells are constantly eavesdropping on your internal dialogue. Somebody inside you is having a conversation with themselves all the time. In a moment, we'll try and figure out who this person is, and what their local address might be. But for the moment, I think you'll acknowledge that whoever this person is, he or she or it never shuts up. The conversation is going on all the time. Ask a good neurobiologist, and they'll tell you that the immune system is listening to this conversation. In fact, ask a good neurobiologist, what's the essential difference between the immune system and the nervous system? They'll tell you there isn't any. The immune system is a circulating nervous system. And if that wasn't intriguing enough and interesting enough, the same phenomenon occurs in the other cells of our body. Today, if you say, I have a gut feeling about such and such, you're not speaking metaphorically at all. You're speaking literally. Your gut makes the same chemicals that your brain makes when it produces thought, when it manufactures thought. In fact, you can trust your gut feelings, possibly a little more, because gut cells haven't yet evolved to the stage where they doubt their own thinking. So, what I'm trying to say is that this body of molecules is actually the objective experience of consciousness. And the mind is the subjective experience of consciousness. But that there is an inseparability between the two. They're the same phenomenon in different disguises. We experience information and energy, and this shouldn't be so difficult to understand today because we live in the world of information and energy. All our technology today is information technology and information technology. We experience information and energy subjectively as our mind. And we experience information and energy objectively as our body, but also as the physical world. That the physical world out there is made up of information and energy that we experience through our sensors. Our sensors are just transducers that convert information and energy into taste and texture and form and color. We, you and I, we give form and texture and color and taste and smell to that field, which is a radically ambiguous and ceaselessly flowing quantum soup of information and energy. And we experience that same information and energy here as the physical body. And we experience the same information and energy in our mind as our thoughts and feelings and emotions and desires. But it's all the same in different disguises. That's why there's an ancient saying in Vedic literature. It says, I am that, you are that, all this is that. And that's all there is. And if you understand that, then good night and thank you.